gang star flip the kill switch. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Journal, young gang star flip the kill switch. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose, pose. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose. Gang star flip the kill switch. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose, pose. Jojo, pose, 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 pose, pose. Gang star flip the kill switch. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose, pose. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose. Switch. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Flip the kill switch. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. 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 Jojo, pose, pose. Young gang star flip the kill switch. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Pose, pose. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Are you sure you're not an enemy stand user? Star flip the kill switch. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Bring the beat life like Journal. Young gang star flip the kill switch. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Kill switch. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo. Serious. Bring the beat life like Journal. Young gang star flip the kill switch. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Built to the top like a pyramid. My lineage lit and it's serious. Bring the beat life like Journal. Young gang star flip the kill switch. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Star flip the kill switch. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Gang star flip the kill switch. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose. Kill switch. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose. Young gang star flip the kill switch. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. 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 Jojo, pose, pose. The kill switch. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Serious, bring the beat life like Jojo. Young gang star flip the kill switch. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Built to the top like a pyramid. My lineage lit and it's serious. Bring the beat life like Jojo. Young gang star flip the kill switch. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose, pose. Serious, bring the beat life like Jojo. Young gang star flip the kill switch. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose, pose. Kill switch. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Switch. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose. Built to the top like a pyramid. My lineage lit and it's serious. Bring the beat life like Jojo. Young gang star flip the kill switch. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. 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 Young gang star flip the kill switch. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. The kill switch. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo. The kill switch. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose. Serious, bring the beat life like Jojo. Young gang star flip the kill switch. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. 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 Young gang star flip the kill switch. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Are you sure you're not an enemy stand user? Young gang star flip the kill switch. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose, pose. Young gang star flip the kill switch. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose. Kill switch. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose. Young gang star flip the kill switch. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Kill switch. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose, pose. Serious, bring the beat life like Jojo. Young gang star flip the kill switch. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose. Serious, bring the beat life like Jojo. Young gang star flip the kill switch. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo star flip the kill switch. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Young gang star flip the kill switch. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Are you sure you're not a Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose, pose. Bring the beat life like Jojo. Young gang star flip the kill switch. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Young gang star flip the kill switch. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose. Beat life like Jojo. Young gang star flip the kill switch. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Young gang star flip the kill switch. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Flip the kill switch. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo, pose, pose, pose. Jojo.